Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, May 5th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Russia says that the US was behind the drone attack on the Kremlin. So on Thursday, Russia said the US was behind the drone attack that targeted the Kremlin, which Moscow said was an attempt on Russian President Vladimir Putin's life. So this is from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman. He said, quote, "We know very well that the decisions to carry out such actions, such terrorist attacks, are not made in Kiev. Rather, it is precisely in Washington." End quote. He added that, quote, "Often even the targets themselves are not determined by Kiev, but by Washington," end quote. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova made similar comments. She wrote on Telegram, quote, "First and foremost, the creators and handlers of the Kiev regime who hail from Washington, London, and NATO bear overall responsibility for everything that Ukraine is perpetrating," end quote. So the comments drew a denial of involvement in the drone attack from the White House. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said, quote, "I can assure you that there was no involvement by the United States in this. Whatever it was did not involve us. We had nothing to do with this," end quote. So the comments from Moscow suggest that Russia is considering a major escalation in response to this. I mean, them blaming the U.S. for what they're saying was an attempt on Putin's life has all sorts of implications for what sort of retaliation there could be. And Peskov said that Russia was considering a wide variety of responses to the drone attack. He said that he couldn't provide any details and that they would be well thought out steps, so that signals are going to take their time figuring out how they're going to respond to this. And Zelensky, he was in the Netherlands on Thursday. He was in Finland the day that this attack happened because, an attack against him could be a potential response. And that's something I've seen some Russian members of the State Duma, their legislature, say that they should, attack, try to get Zelensky. And when it comes to, the idea that the U.S. was involved in this, who knows what the story is with this particular drone attack. But there has been a pretty big uptick in recent weeks and recent months of some of Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, whether it's drone, shelling across the border. And when there was a big one in December when they targeted a Russian airbase where Russia had bombers located, there was a report in Asia Times that quoted NATO officials who said those drones used GPS data that they got from the U.S. So it's definitely possible that in some way the U.S. enabled these drone strikes, but whether they were directly involved or not, but it's definitely concerning. This is not a place we want to be when you have the world's largest nuclear power telling the other world's major nuclear power that they think they're responsible for an assassination attempt on the president. I mean, this is a pretty serious thing that's going on here. So hopefully things don't get out of control. But I don't know. Hopefully some of this wakes some people up in the U.S. in Washington and gets them on the phone, with Moscow. All right, the next one here. Pentagon inks a multi-billion-dollar contract for Javelin anti-tank missiles, and this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. The Pentagon has ordered more Javelin anti-tank missiles manufactured by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin as Washington's stockpile dwindles. Taipei is due to receive hundreds of these weapon systems next year, and the White House has sent thousands to Kiev. So Lockheed and Raytheon's contract is to produce an indefinite quantity of Javelins over 3 years in a deal that could be worth as much as $7.2 billion. So just unlimited money for Lockheed and Raytheon. However many Javelins they can crank out, they'll be able to sell them. The weapons makers jointly produce the anti-tank weapon. Missiles will be distributed to the Army, Marines, Navy, as well as the international customers. So after Russia invaded Ukraine last year, the White House sent thousands of these Javelin missiles to Ukraine. 2 months into the war, the Center for Strategic and International Studies assessed that the U.S. sent about 7,000 to Ukraine, which is about a third of the American stockpile. So that's a lot. And Lockheed is working to increase production to about 4,000 Javelin missiles per year. Doug Bush, the head of acquisitions for the U.S. Army, claimed that the contract shows America's commitment to boosting weapons production. Each missile costs between $160,000 and $180,000. So that's quite a bit. And, this just goes to show how these companies, Raytheon, who previously employed Lloyd Austin right before he went to become the head of the Pentagon, he was on the board of Raytheon. And now he oversees this policy that involves shipping, all these Raytheon-made weapons into Ukraine, and also the Stingers. I believe the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles are also made by Raytheon, and those were, becoming obsolete. They haven't made them in a while, and then all of a sudden, there's this new demand for them. So again, you just see how this is a total boon for these weapons makers who are very influential in our government. All right, the next one here is from Declassified UK. A pro-ISIS fighter in Ukraine received UK missiles and SAS training. So a Belarusian criminal who was reported dead last month in Ukraine claimed to have received training from Britain's Special Air Service. He was also filmed in possession of UK-supplied rocket launchers. This is according to a report from Declassified. So this man, Daniil Lyashchuk, he came from a far-right hooligan background until he converted to Islam and expressed support for jihadist groups like the Islamic State. He led a pro-Ukraine militia despite a conviction from a Kiev court for torturing detainees in the Donbass. He made the claim about receiving SAS training on his official Telegram channel on March 27th. The post had been viewed over 100,000 times. His death on the front lines near Bakhmut was reported 5 days later. So this is an interesting story here, and they go into more detail about who this guy was, if you want to go check that out. But, when it comes to the SAS soldiers, the British SAS, one of the first reports, I want to say it was April 2022, of, NATO boots on the ground post-invasion of Ukraine. There were NATO trainers in Ukraine. They said that they pulled them out before Russia invaded, including U.S. troops. But then there was this report from the Times of London just a few months into the war that said British SAS soldiers were in Ukraine training Ukrainian soldiers on anti-tank weapons. And the recent leaks from Jack Teixeira revealed that there's 50 British Special Operations Forces currently in Ukraine, or not, maybe not currently. I believe that assessment was from March. So as of a few months ago, there was 50 British Special Operations Forces. They had the biggest presence out of the countries that have Special Operations soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, which includes the U.S. According to that document, the U.S. has 14 on the ground there. So I think it's definitely possible that they did train this guy, and the fact that he was seen with the British rockets, kind of corroborates his story potentially. So it's just interesting. You never know what type of people are getting all these weapons as they're being flooded into Ukraine with very little oversight. All right, the next one here, NATO to open an office in Japan, the first in Asia. So NATO is planning to open a liaison office in Japan next year, which will be the alliance's the first of its kind in Asia for the NATO alliance. And this is according to a report from Nikkei Asia. In recent years, NATO has turned its gaze toward the Asia-Pacific region and named China as a systemic challenge in its 2022 strategic concept. As part of its strategy against China, the alliance is deepening cooperation with countries in the region. So according to Nikkei, the purpose of the liaison office in Japan is to allow the military alliance to conduct periodic consultations with Japan and key partners in the region, such as South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, as China emerges as a new challenge alongside its traditional focus on Russia. The report said that NATO and Japan will take more steps to increase cooperation by signing an agreement known as an individually tailored partnership program ahead of the NATO summit that will be held in Lithuania this June. Japan also plans to open an independent mission to NATO separate from their embassy in Belgium. In response to the news, China warned of NATO's plans to expand into Asia. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said, quote, Asia is an anchor for peace and stability and a promising land for cooperation and development, not a wrestling ground for geopolitical competition. NATO's continued eastern foray into the Asia-Pacific and interference in regional affairs will inevitably undermine regional peace and stability and stoke camp confrontation. This calls for high vigilance among regional countries, end quote. So, of course, China's not happy that NATO has pointed the finger at them as their next, challenge or threat, whatever they want to call them, second to Russia. For the U.S., they say China is the top threat and Russia is second. For NATO, it's still Russia and then China. But it's still, this is just a sign of NATO might start slowly creeping into the region more. Even though there's definitely some European countries that don't want to follow the U.S. into this potential conflict with China in this region. But I think there's still going to be a lot of things like this that we're going to see more of. All right. The next one here. The U.S. and the Philippines make their defense commitment in the South China Sea official. So the U.S. and the Philippines on Wednesday agreed on new guidelines for the 1951 U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty that formalized the U.S. commitment to going to war if Philippine vessels come under attack in the South China Sea. So this is something that I talk about a lot just because I think it's something a lot of people don't realize, that the U.S. is committed to going to war over this dispute in the South China Sea between the Philippines and China over these rocks and reefs. And for years now, U.S. officials have said that, their treaty that they've had with the Philippines for all these years applies to the South China Sea as tensions have heated up in those waters. But Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., he came to Washington this week and he wanted, a stronger commitment. They wanted it in writing. And so they issued these guidelines, and they're written out guidelines that they're adding to this defense treaty. And it's the first time since the Mutual Defense Treaty was signed that they updated it like this with these new guidelines. So according to the Pentagon, quote, the guidelines reaffirm that an armed attack in the Pacific, including anywhere in the South China Sea, on either of their public vessels, aircraft, or armed forces, which includes their coast guards, would invoke mutual defense commitments under Article 4 and 5 of the 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, end quote. So, you notice how it says both. If the U.S. gets attacked, I guess the Philippines is committed to entering the war. So they're committing themselves to, a future, if there's a future war over Taiwan, there's going to be fighting in the South China Sea. And, if the U.S. is involved and the Philippines is basically committing that they will enter that war in the future. The Pentagon said that the guidelines also take into account threats that may arise in several domains, including land, sea, air, space, cyberspace, and it includes measures of ways to increase cooperation across all of those domains. And this new commitment, it comes, tensions are really high right now in the South China Sea, and it seems like it's just going to get worse. There's that recent incident, Chinese and Philippine vessels nearly collided. The U.S. is thinking about doing joint patrols with the with the Philippines Coast Guard. And that's just really going to set things on a really escalatory path, I think. It's just not looking good over in the South China Sea when it comes to the tensions. All right, so I just want to mention again that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com. If you could help us out, we really appreciate the support. This is how we get by. We are entirely reader funded. That's the way it's been for over 20. How long has it been now? It was founded in 1995, 28 years. And that's how we've been able to keep our independent line and our anti-interventionist, point of view. We can give you coverage like this from our unique perspective. But this only works if our readers are engaged with us and are supporting us. So if you want to be part of, what we do, please help us out and go to antiwar.com/donate. It's tax deductible. You can write it off. So please go do that. so we could finish this fundraiser and speed things along here so we could focus on doing what we do. So again, antiwar.com/donate. All right. The next one here, U.S. shifts its rhetoric on engagement with Syria. So this is interesting. A White House National Security Council official told The National that the Biden administration was encouraged by a meeting between Syrian and other Arab foreign ministers that took place in Amman on Monday. So these comments mark a significant shift in rhetoric from the U.S., very significant, which has previously strongly discouraged regional engagement with the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad. As I've gone over a lot, the U.S. has always been very against it. And the foreign ministers of Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt issued a joint statement after the meeting that said it was the beginning of a process, quote, aimed at reaching a solution to the crisis in Syria consistent with Security Council Resolution 2254 and addressing all the consequences of the humanitarian, political, and security crisis, end quote. So a National Security Council representative told The National that the administration was, quote, encouraged to see the joint communique mention many priorities that we and our partners share, end quote. The official added that the U.S. hopes, quote, that the Syrian regime will follow through on its commitments in good faith and in accordance with international norms, end quote. So the official was pleased that the statement mentioned the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which was passed in 2015 and calls for a solution to the crisis in Syria through an inclusive and Syrian-led political process. So this is a Security Council thing that, Russia agreed to as well. It's kind of vague, but the U.S. always, mentions it in kind of their rhetoric about Syria. So on Tuesday, State Department spokesman Vedant Patel, he was asked about the meeting in Amman, and he didn't just dismiss it outright, which is what I would expect, which is what the U.S. has done, in similar situations about other Arab countries meeting with the Syrian government. So he said, quote, we have seen these reports and understand that a communique was issued by the participants talking about their effort to reach a solution relating to the crisis in Syria that is consistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. And we continue to believe that a political solution as outlined in 2254 remains the only viable option to the conflict, end quote. So not really an endorsement or anything, but it's not, not criticizing what happened in Amman. The State Department has previously issued strong statements against regional countries normalizing or engaging with Damascus. In February, the State Department said it was opposed to countries upgrading their ties with Assad, even if it was part of an effort to help Syria with earthquake relief. So that's how, harsh the rhetoric has been. So again, this is a pretty big shift, I think. And U.S. partners in the Middle East, they've ignored these warnings. And I think it's just a matter of can the U.S. just resist what's happening? The reality that these countries are accepting Assad, back into the Arab fold, they want to bring him back into the Arab League, just accepting the fact that he's not going anywhere. Their regime change effort failed. And maybe the U.S. is sort of realizing that they can't just resist everything. And the Wall Street Journal reported in March that a potential normalization deal between Damascus and its neighbors would involve Arab countries lobbying the U.S. to lift sanctions on Syria, which are designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. So maybe they will also try to get the U.S. to leave Syria because the U.S. has 900 troops in eastern Syria. And the joint statement, as I went over right after the meeting happened, the joint statement that these Arab foreign ministers released expressed support for Syria regaining control of its territory. And that includes, territory occupied by the U.S. And this fact was not mentioned by either U.S. official who discussed it. So I think it's just an interesting shift in rhetoric. And hopefully, again, when I'm talking about these normalization talks between countries in Syria, my hope is that it will eventually lead to the U.S. having no choice but to leave, because the U.S. is still trying to, of course, maintain influence over the Saudis and the UAE and those countries, and maybe they're realizing they have to pick their battles and can't just oppose this Syria thing that's happening, that's moving along, no matter what the U.S. thinks. All right, the next one here. The U.S. says a Russian missile almost hit a U.S. MQ-9 drone over Syria. So, a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone was fired at by a Russian SA-22 Pantsir air defense system in Syria back in November. And this incident was first revealed by one of the Pentagon leaks allegedly leaked by Jack Teixeira. And a U.S. official told Air and Space Forces magazine this week that they confirmed that the incident happened, and they said that the Russian missile exploded within 40 feet about of the MQ-9 drone and damaged it. It didn't take it down, but it did damage it. And really, this incident, if true, it's not really clear exactly like why Russia fired on the MQ-9, if it was intentional or not. But they say this is not a common thing. This doesn't happen. This is the first known time that Russian air defenses have fired at a U.S. aircraft in Syria. And I think this just highlights the danger of the U.S. presence in Syria. That's what Matt Gaetz was saying when he introduced that resolution to pull out, is that it's a tripwire for a conflict with Russia and Iran and, just a wider sparking a wider war in the region. This incident really shows that, I think. All right. The next one here, President Biden signs an order to impose sanctions on Sudan. So on Thursday, Biden signed an executive order, no need to go to Congress or anything, expanding his authorities to impose sanctions on Sudan over the conflict that broke out between rival generals on April 15th. So they're still fighting. Al Burhan, who is Sudan's de facto leader and the head of the army, and he's been fighting against Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti, and he runs the Rapid Support Forces. In a statement, Biden said that the conflict in Sudan must end. His order gives him sweeping authorities to sanction any person or entity that the U.S. determines is involved in activities that threaten the peace, security, and stability of Sudan. The order said that the situation in Sudan, quote, including the military's seizure of power in October 2021 and the outbreak of inter-service fighting in April 2023, constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, end quote. The order said that it is U.S. policy to, quote, support a transition to democracy and civilian transitional government in Sudan, to defend such a transitional government from those who would prevent its initial formation through violence, end quote. So, with this order, he didn't impose any sanctions yet. So this just gives him the authority to do it. Again, bypassing Congress. So we might see some sanctions soon. And I know Blinken, I think, was threatening that he was going to sanction both sides, which, what is that going to accomplish? We know sanctions hurt ordinary people. They don't change the targeted government. And even when it comes to individual sanctions against government officials, because then if they can't access or offshore funds or something, then they're just going to look inward to, make their money, and it's not gonna, they're gonna take that away from their people. It just never, it always lands on the ordinary citizens in the countries that are being targeted. So the Pentagon has been helping evacuate people from Sudan. So far, they're saying over 1,000 American citizens have left. The Pentagon said something kind of strange on Thursday. They said that their U.S. troops in Sudan or around Sudan, wherever they are, it's not clear exactly where they are set to change their role, as the U.S. is not expecting the fighting to end anytime soon. But they didn't specify what that meant. And there's been 3 U.S. naval ships off the coast of Sudan. One has been transporting people from Sudan across the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia. All right. The next one here, AQAP slams the Saudi-Iran normalization deal. So this shows what side the U.S. has been on in Yemen. So according to a report from the New Arab, the leader of the Yemen-based al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, has slammed Saudi Arabia for its normalization deal with Iran. In a video released earlier this week, AQAP head Khalid Batarfi said that Riyadh was conceding defeat in Yemen by normalizing with Iran. He claimed that AQAP was the only force left fighting for Sunnis in Yemen against the Houthis, who are Zaidi Shias. The U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition in Yemen has fought on the same side as al-Qaeda against the Houthis, and weapons sold to the Saudis and the UAE have ended up in the hands of the terror group in Yemen. There's very detailed reporting on this from the Associated Press. In 2018, they found that the Saudi UAE coalition hired al-Qaeda members to help fight against the Houthis. The AP report said that coalition-backed militias actively recruit al-Qaeda militants or those who were recently members because they're considered exceptional fighters. And before the Obama administration backed the Saudi coalition against the Houthis in Yemen in March 2015, the U.S. was actually cooperating with the Houthis against AQAP. In January 2015, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. had forged ties with the Houthis as part of a strategy to maintain its fight against the key branch of al-Qaeda. So AQAP's complaints about the Saudi-Iran normalization deal come as a peace deal between Riyadh and the Houthis seem near. No deals yet, but they've been talking, and it sounds good, very good progress. The warring sides have engaged in Omani-mediated talks and recently exchanged thousands of prisoners. So the Iran backs the Houthis politically, but they deny that they arm the Houthis. You know, this idea that that the war is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia isn't right. Iran is not nearly as involved in this conflict as Saudi Arabia, which is actively fighting in it. Iran's not. They're not even involved in these negotiations. I think that says something. And but still, I mean, again, this really just shows who the U.S. has been fighting for all these years in Yemen in this brutal war. All right, the next one here. So this is from Kevin Gostola. He is at his website, The Dissenter, and it's about what I went over yesterday, the State Department discussing Assange. So he really knows his stuff when it comes to Assange. And I didn't realize that the State Department, this was the first time that the State Department commented really on the case of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and backed the prosecution against him, saying that he was responsible for these leaks and not answering if he was a journalist. So apparently this is the first time that the State Department has really done that. Before, they would just refer reporters to the Justice Department and not comment on the case. So that's interesting. I didn't realize it. So he's really great on Assange and whistleblower stuff, Kevin. So go check out this article if you want to see the details on that. And then the last one here is from Middle East Eye. Another Israeli raid in the West Bank kills 3 Palestinians in Nablus. So 3 Palestinians were killed on Thursday morning by Israeli forces in the historic center of the occupied West Bank city of Nablus. The Palestinian Health Ministry said the Israeli army said that 2 of the 3 Palestinians killed were suspected to have been involved in the attack near Hamra, an illegal Israeli settlement in the Jordan Valley in April, which killed 3 members of a British Israeli settler family. Israel's army identified the killed suspects. The identity of those killed, however, could not immediately be verified by Palestinian sources, Palestinian authorities. The Palestinian Health Ministry said that the facial features of the 2 Palestinians killed were completely distorted due to the intensity of the shooting, making it difficult to identify them. So more violence in the West Bank. It seems pretty common now, these raids. But that's it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints, one from Ben Freeman and William D. Hartung, Not Your Grandfather's Military-Industrial Complex. One from Ted Snyder, Coming in from the Cold, Escaping Isolation. One from Ryan McMacken, 20 years later, Remembering the Disastrous and Failed Iraq War. That's over at the Mises Institute. One from Daniel Klein, David Hume's Warning on Forever Wars. Go check that out. And our spotlight is from Jacob Hornberger, The U.S. Military's Recruiting Crisis is a Positive Sign. That's over at the Future Freedom Foundation. But that's everything for today. That is everything for the week. You could always support us. Please help us with the fundraiser at antiwar.com/donate. Share the show around, share the site around, tell your friends about it. But I'll be back after the weekend with some more news. Thanks for listening.